Hi guys, it's Elizabeth Morse. I am the host of Simply Out of the Box, and I'm coming to you from my office today. Normally, I am filming in my kitchen or in my garden, but it has occurred to me that the last few videos I've made, I've spent a lot of time cooking and a lot of time talking, but I haven't really told you all why it is that you should listen to me or believe what I say. So I thought I would share some of my background before we get started with today's topic and maybe inspire a little bit more confidence with you all. So I live in Indiana. I grew up here, central Indiana, born and bred Hoosier, and I have always been interested in gardens and growing things. I started planting my first gardens at my home, well over 20 years ago, and I have always had gardens since then. I was in the restaurant business right out of college and ended up buying my own place in 2001. It was a restaurant that had been around already for a number of years and had a great reputation. And I wrote menus, I wrote wine lists, and began growing things in my garden, kind of specialty things to take to the restaurant and enhance the options that were available to us from local produce companies. So from there, I continued and kind of got some formal education in gardening. I took an a master gardener class and completed those hours and then moved on to become an advanced master gardener. I also crossed over and started helping kids with some growing projects in our local 4-H group, and I still do that. I am actually the county supervisor for the strawberry project, so teaching kids about how to grow berries, kind of random but fun, and began doing a lot of writing for some different papers, for some blogs, and that covered everything from food and wine and entertaining to growing things and preserving and beekeeping and chicken keeping. So I just have all these kind of random domestic skills, and I've recently partnered with a group in southeastern Missouri called the Garden Shed, and they are working hard to bring all kinds of good food to people in their community who are struggling with food insecurity. They don't have a lot of shopping options in that area, and they approached me, and we've put together Simply Out of the Box to inspire people who are getting food monthly, maybe that they don't know what to do with, maybe some fresh things that normally they wouldn't choose for themselves at the grocery. And the goal is to show people that cooking fresh food and growing fresh food for your family can be really fun and certainly nutritionally valuable. And that is what the goal of the series is. So the things that I have been cooking the past few weeks are all things that folks might have received if they are picking up a food bundle there in Missouri, but certainly things that we all have across the country. And so hopefully you'll find these things useful. I am talking today specifically about preserving food. And I think that, it is so important to eat fresh things, but we certainly could benefit from being able to stretch our food and make it last a little bit longer, especially with food being kind of a hotter commodity than normal these days, and especially with our strange COVID-laced times. So if you want to stick around, I'm going to transition to the kitchen in a little bit and talk about, I'm going to talk first about the different ways that you can preserve food, and then we're going to move into the kitchen and I'm going to show you some of those things in practice. So stay tuned, and thanks for listening. So there are several ways that you can preserve food, and while there are tons more than we're going to talk about today, I thought I would just kind of to touch on them and kind of get your juices flowing as far as how do I put away food. Maybe I have extra, maybe I have stuff that is just not something that I want to eat right now and I want to save it for later. So food preservation methods, the three most common and the ones that we're going to talk about today are canning, freezing, and drying. And foods can be preserved really inexpensively by using those three things, canning, freezing, or drying techniques. Modern day food preservation methods such as water bath canning can help you preserve really easily. And after you understand the basic procedures for some of these, I think you will really want to give them a try. So canning is something that I've been doing for a really long time. I was a water bath canner, and what that means is you are putting food into glass jars with lids that are designed for canning, and then you put them in a big pot of boiling water, for lack of a better description, and you process them, which means you let them boil for a certain amount of time. And what that does is it helps to seal the food in a jar and destroys any microorganisms that would be in the jar that would cause the food to spoil. Proper canning techniques stop the spoilage by heating the food for a specific period of time and killing the unwanted microorganisms. They also, and a lot of you, if you have maybe grandparents or even parents who can remember, as the jars are lifted out, you can hear the air being driven from the jar because of the vacuum that's created, and they make a really cool little popping sound. So that's kind of a sound from childhood that I remember. And I will point out that although you'll hear of lots and lots of canning methods that have been used over the years, there really are only two that are approved by the USDA, and that's water bath canning and pressure canning. There are a lot of old methods that used to be around, and as time has gone on, we have discovered that those really are unsafe. So again, the only two that are approved by the USDA are water bath canning and pressure canning. As I said, I have been a water bath canner for a really long time, and I was given a pressure canner several years ago by my mom to try and inspire me to try some new things, because with water bath canning, you're really limited to high acid foods. That is, things that have vinegar in them or citric acid, tomatoes, but things like green beans and corn and anything with meat in it, I couldn't do any of those things because frankly, I was afraid of pressure canning. So finally, I actually sold the old pressure canner that I was given as a gift because I was like, I'm never going to use it. I'm scared of it. I'm not going to do it. And I, this year, decided I was going to bite the bullet. I bought myself a brand new one, came with the book, all the instructions, and I have embraced that, and I have kind of been going crazy. It's been super fun and has made my garden season really, really go crazy, because it used to be that once my freezer was full, I kind of stopped because I didn't really have anything else to do with the excess. And now I can pressure can things and make them shelf stable and not take up freezer space, and it's been very cool. So pressure canning is a little different than water bath canning. It is much like the old pressure cookers that our parents and grandparents used, with the weight on top that would hiss and kind of sputter, and everybody said, oh, don't touch it, it's gonna blow your face off. And that is definitely something that could happen if you did not follow the proper precautions. But pressure canning uses a large kettle that produces steam in a locked compartment. So you fill up your jars, and the kettle reaches internal temperatures of like 240 degrees under specific pressure. And the pressure is either measured with a little dial gauge on top of the canner or a weight. You use pressure canning again for, you could certainly do tomatoes and higher acid things, but it's specifically for processing vegetables, low acid foods, meat, poultry, and fish. So with all the food insecurities that are happening these days, I thought it would be a great time to talk about best ways to preserve food. And there are three major methods. There are tons extra, but the three big ones are canning, freezing, and drying. And you can preserve foods inexpensively by using these techniques. Modern day food preservation methods like water bath canning are really great and kind of a great starting point. And after you understand the basics for that, you can concentrate on learning recipes and maybe branching out into pressure canning. And I'm going to tell you the difference. So I started water bath canning many, many years ago. I had tons of extra stuff in my garden, mostly tomatoes, frankly, and I had no idea what to do with them. I'd make some chili, I'd put that in the freezer, I'd make spaghetti, we'd have salad all summer long. And then finally, I decided that I was going to try and make big batches of spaghetti sauce and big batches of salsa, two things that my family really loves, and figure out how to preserve them. So I bought a book, just a really basic one, I think at probably the hardware store where I bought the actual water bath canner, which is really just a big stock pot with a rack in it. And figured out how to do it. And this is the way it goes. So canning is the process of applying heat to food that's sealed in a jar in order to destroy microorganisms that cause food to go bad. And if you are properly canning, you will stop the spoilage because you heat the food for a specific period of time, which kills all the unwanted gross stuff in there, like any little microorganisms. During the canning process, the air is driven out of the jar as the jar is heated, and a vacuum is created as the jar cools and it seals. And you probably know the sound when you open a can, it kind of makes a pop sound. Well, as the jars are sealing, it makes a pop sound too. And it is something that I remember from childhood, and maybe if you get into trying some canning, you'll remember that sound as well. And it's very, very gratifying when you hear that pop, because you're like, I did it. My food is preserved. So water bath canning, as I said, is just basically a big old stock pot. And it's also referred to as hot water canning. You fill up your jars. They are submerged in water and heated to an internal temperature of 212 degrees. I think that's right, for a specific period of time. If you use this method, you're going to want to process high acid foods like fruit, tomatoes, pickles, any pickled foods, and that's a great starting point, as I said. But then if you want to branch out and go with other things maybe that you're growing in your garden, for instance, green beans, which are a low acid food, then we would want to look into pressure canning. So pressure canning is a little different in that it also uses a large kettle, but it produces steam in a locked compartment. And the jars are filled in the kettle. They reach an internal temperature of 240 degrees under a specific pressure that's stated in pounds. So for instance, if you were looking at a recipe, it might say something like process under 15 pounds of pressure for 75 minutes. And that's measured with either a dial gauge or a weighted gauge, depending on the type of pressure canner that you have. Again, you're going to use pressure canners for things like vegetables, beans, corn, other low acid foods like meat, poultry, fish, and soup. And really what it does is just gives you so much more versatility in what you're able to preserve, especially if you've got a garden that's going crazy and your freezer's full and you've eaten all you can eat and you just have stuff that you want to save for later. It's really a great thing to invest in those if you're able, or maybe somebody in your family has one that you could borrow. And one final note about canning. So with canning, obviously you need glass jars. Most people use ball jars, but there are lots of different brands out there. You also need flat lids. Those are one-time use lids, and then the metal ring that holds the lids in place. And that, along with the actual stock pots, the stock pot or your pressure canner, is going to be kind of a significant first investment. I will say that I have had the same water bath canner for 20 years. It wasn't very expensive. I want to say it was under 20 bucks when I bought it. But I've had it all these years, and it's paid for itself time and time and time again. A pressure canner is definitely going to be a little bit more expensive, but again, totally worth the investment. If investing is something that you are not really interested in doing right now, there are also great ways to preserve food by freezing and by drying, and both of those can actually be done with very, very little to no upfront investment. So we're going to talk about those as well. So the second method that we're going to talk about today is freezing food. And freezing food is the art of preparing, packaging, and freezing foods at their peak of freshness. The great thing about freezing is that you can freeze almost any fresh vegetable and fruit, meat, fish, bread, cake, clear soups, casseroles, cheese. And the key to freezing foods are to make sure that it's really fresh, that you're freezing it as quickly as possible, and that you keep it at a proper frozen temperature, which is 0 degrees. Properly packaging food in freezer paper or freezer containers prevents deteriorating freezer burn. You've probably heard of that before, maybe even experienced it. Damage occurs when your food comes into contact with the dry air of a freezer, and although freezer damaged food won't hurt you, it tastes gross, and it actually looks gross too. So definitely want to avoid that. And some things that you can do to help avoid freezer burn are reducing exposure to air. Wrap your food tightly. You want to avoid fluctuating temperatures by keeping the freezer door closed as much as possible, and kind of know what you want before you go in. Don't open it up and go window shopping. Just think about it and grab stuff, and that way it'll keep your freezer nice and cold. Finally, don't overfill your freezer. An overly full freezer reduces the airflow and circulation and speeds up freezer damage. So just a few tips there about freezing. And again, we're going to talk about how to do some of these things. I'm going to show you in just a little bit here when we move to the kitchen. So we've talked today about two methods for food preservation. We've spoken about canning and freezing, and now I'm just going to touch on drying food. Drying is actually the oldest method known for preserving food. When you dry food, you're exposing it to a temperature that's high enough to remove moisture, but low enough that it doesn't cook. Good air circulation assists you in evenly drying food. And then once you've got this dried food, the benefit is that you can stick it in a bag, you can stick it in a plastic container, or even a glass jar, and stash it in your pantry or on your countertop or whatever. And it's not going to take up freezer space or refrigerator space, and it's not going to use any of that energy either. It also lasts a really long time. There are three ways that you can choose to dehydrate food. One is an electric dehydrator, which is actually an appliance. And the other two methods are in your oven or using the heat of the sun. And I will tell you that my very favorite method is the electric dehydrator. I've done all three, and there are a couple reasons why. Number one, it is an appliance, so you do have to make that investment up front. I think mine was from Big Lots like 20 years ago, and it was like $20, and it's still going strong. It has, I think, 6 trays, which is plenty for what I need it for. And that's just something you're going to have to decide if you're interested in moving forward with drying. You know what your family might need, and they do have many sizes and many price ranges, but they can be had on the cheap. And here's why I like them. They include a thermostat and a fan, and that regulates temperatures much better than either of the other two methods. Now, that being said, you can dry food in your own oven and by using the heat of the sun, but those processes take a little bit longer, and you're not going to get the consistent results that you would get by using an appliance that is specifically made for dehydrating. Those are 3 overviews that we can think about as we move into the kitchen. I'm going to head downstairs and get out some supplies and show you guys how to do each of those 3 things. And hopefully you'll find some of these methods useful in making your grocery budgets and your fresh food last a little bit longer. See you in just a minute. Okay, I'm back, and we're going to talk a little bit more about freezing. You can use plastic bags, you can use plastic containers, different methods for sure. But what I like to do is use these freezer bags. These are just from the Dollar Tree, really inexpensive, but you definitely want to look for something that has the word freezer on it. And that's because they're a little bit heavier duty. The plastic is thicker, keeps your food a little bit more protected from freezer burn. And they also have these cool labels, and you can write directly on the package what you've got in it and when you froze it, which is super helpful. So I have a bunch of extra carrots right now, and what I did is I blanched them first. Now, carrots are a denser vegetable, and all fresh things have enzymes in them. So when you blanch it, it kind of stops that enzyme process, which is what deteriorates food. And so boiling water, I dropped the carrots in, the raw carrots, for about a minute, really not very long at all. And then I placed them on a plate or a platter, depending on how many you have, and let them cool off. And then, you can see them here, I stuck them in the freezer. So they're frozen, and the reason I did it that way before I put them in a bag is because I don't like them to all get into a big frozen clump. If I need just a few and it was a really big bag, I would not want to have to chisel the carrots out. So I've got them frozen on a sheet, and I'll show you. Super easy. I put them in a bag. I'm going to lay the bag down and press the extra air out, because the air is what will allow freezer burn to set in. So you can see I pressed almost all the air out, hardly anything. I'm going to label them, stick them in the freezer. That's it. Super simple. Another method that we discussed is dehydrating, and I thought I would show you my very favorite method I talked about is an actual food dehydrator. Has a couple parts. It's got a lid. You can see it's got holes for ventilation. Inside the machine are a series of trays, and these are what you would lay your food out on. You can kind of see just like that. And I have, I think, 6 in here. They stack together, and then they sit on this base, and the base is what's got the fan and the heating element. So once it's plugged in, it produces heat, but not so much that your things will cook. And with the racks, the air can move about and dry your food pretty quickly. So that's a great thing to do if you want to invest. Mine wasn't very expensive. I've had it for a lot of years. They come in all different sizes. You can spend $1 gazillion. You can spend hardly any. But what I would recommend is, if you think you might be interested in dehydrating and drying foods, is to try it in your oven first and see what the finished product looks like, and if it's something that you think that your family would use again. And then you can make a decision about whether you want to invest or not. I thought I would show you my very favorite food to make in a dehydrator, and I also thought I would show you how to do it if you are not ready to invest in a machine and you want to just try it out and see if your family likes it. So I've got a bunch of apples right now, and obviously this is a great time of year for apples. You slice the apples really thinly. You can remove the seeds. I've actually already done some here. You can see that I've got just a sheet pan with a piece of parchment paper. I put my apple slices. Again, I like them to be pretty thin. It takes them much less time to dry out that way. And I also like to give them just a little sprinkle of cinnamon. So once you have a whole tray full, you definitely want to leave space between them. And you're going to put them in your preheated oven at 250 degrees for an hour or two, depending on how thick you've made your slices. Obviously, the thicker they are, the longer they're going to take to dry out. But these are a great healthy snack for kids. Once they're dried, you can keep them in an airtight container for about 6 months. So great thing to do. You can do all kinds of different vegetables and fruits though. So this is the simplest method of dehydrating, and give it a whirl, see what you think. So we're going to talk a little bit about canning, and just in fairness, I'm going to do a whole nother video and devote that to canning, and then probably another to pressure canning, because there really is kind of a lot of information involved in learning how to can, and it's important to know those things so that you're not creating something that's unsafe for your family to eat. But I thought I would go over the basics. So this is my water bath canner. As you can see, it's kind of just a big old stock pot. It's got a lid. Mine is really old and beat up because I use it a ton. And it's got this rack. The rack can sit on top. I don't know if you guys can see that. It can sit on top. You load your jars in, and then you can lower it all at once. The rack holds about 7 jars, and here's an example. This is a quart jar, a ball jar that I would use to probably make salsa, applesauce, something like that. At any rate, the lids have 2 parts. There's the ring, and then there's the flat lid. These flat lids have a wax seal on the inside, and these are one use only. After you use them, you got to pitch them. Can't use them more than once. So if I was making salsa, what I would do is I would have sterilized the jar in both parts of the lid in boiling water, and I would have those ready to go sitting on a towel. I would have my salsa made. It would be hot. I would use this funnel. You can see it's kind of a wide mouth funnel. It sits in the jar. And I would fill the jar to about here. And this space between the top of your food and the top of the jar is known as head space. And for salsa, I would use 1/2 inch to 1 inch. So probably fill it up to right there. Then you take a wet towel, and sometimes I like to put a little vinegar on it. Just helps keep it extra clean. And you would wipe around the lid, or I'm sorry, the rim of the jar. Then you put the lid on like that, and then you just screw the band on, but just really barely tight. You don't want to screw it on super tight. And then this would be full and go into the canner. It would process for the correct amount of time. Basically, you've got boiling water, and what it does is it creates pressure inside the jar. I don't know if you can hear this. This is a little button on the top, and when you take your finished product out of the canner, you'll sit it out on the counter to cool, and you'll actually hear those pops, and you know then that your jar is sealed. When that happens, and these are all cooled off, you actually remove the rings for storage. So you'll store your canned goods like this. You can see I've got a label on mine. This one happens to be spaghetti sauce, and you can see there, nice and tight. That's not going to come apart. So that's the very basic part of the canning process. And again, we're going to do another one-off with a lot more detail, maybe make a few recipes, and then we're going to talk about pressure canning too, because that's a whole different ballgame. It's a totally different apparatus, and it's kind of a science all in and of itself. But hopefully that gives you some inspiration, and maybe you can consider starting to can a few things for your family.